All right, hello, welcome. Thank you for sharing part of your afternoon with us. I'm Regina Malveaux. I'm the director of the Washington State Women's Commission, and we're really glad that you all decided to join us this afternoon. So as you know, today we're going to be talking about what does it mean to invest in the prevention of sexual and domestic violence. And this conversation really came about, and we decided to do it this month, as this month is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, which has been happening for about 30 years. And this month we're looking at ways that we can really turn a spotlight on the issue of domestic violence, and hopefully not just intervention and supporting victims through victim services, but again, how we look at preventing these kinds of violence. So there really has been, as you know, a national conversation about divesting and investing, and how the reallocation of law enforcement funding to the social determinants of health can really improve public health and public safety. We know that law enforcement tends to be funded significantly higher than other public services. And really, so what we wanted to talk about today is what might that reinvestment look like, and what does it mean to invest in community-based organizations that are doing prevention work. And so really, really excited that today we've got this amazing panel of experts who come from local, state, and federal work. And so kind of the 4 points that we're going to discuss this afternoon are preventing violence is a public health issue, and Virginia Duplessis, I believe, from Futures Without Violence, which is a national organization, will be joining us to discuss that point. And then we'll be looking at what prevention programming looks like at the community-based level. And there we will have Tess and Sojourner from the YWCA Pierce County here in Washington joining us. And then talking about what prevention looks like for young people of color in communities that are heavily policed, what that looks like. And Taryn will be joining us from Seattle College. And then finally looking at what developmentally appropriate education for children and youth really around prevention, around the prevention of sexual and domestic violence, how that is implemented at the local level. And we'll have Rebecca Millman of the Harborview Abuse and Trauma Center talking about that. And then we'll entertain any questions that you have. But we're going to start by thanking Grace Huang, who is our commissioner at the Washington State Women's Commission, and she is also the policy director at the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, previously with the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and a deep expert in this content. So thank you, Grace, for inviting the commission to host this panel discussion today. And if I could have you add a few remarks.
Sure. I am, okay, let's see here. You already did the introduction for me. I was going to say a whole bunch, but you already did that. So just a little bit more that I'm with the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, which is a national organization, and we work on addressing issues facing survivors of domestic and sexual violence and human trafficking in Asian and Pacific Islander communities across the United States. And to reiterate what Regina said earlier, we put together this panel to highlight some of the discussions taking place in our communities in light of, larger societal movement discussions about divesting from law enforcement, as well as, the discussions about that have been surrounding the Me Too movement, in light of the protests across the country, including here in Washington, following the death of George Floyd in Minnesota and the deaths of other Black men and women around the country. Many of us who've been working in the domestic violence and sexual assault fields are engaging in a re-examination about what it means to turn to law enforcement as the response to domestic violence, and whether or not we need to be investing more in prevention and community-based solutions to address the issue. And also in light of larger conversations about how prevalent folks' experiences are of sexual assault and sexual harassment throughout our lives, what it really means to be talking about healthy relationships, about consent, about being in relationship with one another. And so I'm hoping that this panel today will be informative and timely and quite frankly, relevant in your personal lives as well as on a professional level. So with that, I wanted to introduce Virginia, who is going to be talking with us about some of the work in her work at Futures Without Violence. And so as an introduction for Virginia, Virginia is the Associate Director of Health at Futures Without Violence, where she provides oversight for initiatives to strengthen partnerships between the healthcare and domestic violence services sector. She was most recently the Assistant Director of Prevention at the Path to Care Center at UC Berkeley, where she was responsible for developing and implementing a comprehensive prevention plan to address gender-based violence, dating and domestic violence, stalking and sexual harassment. And she brings over 20 years of experience in domestic violence, sexual assault, and public health to our presentation today. And she received her BA in Communications from Stanford and her MSW from UC Berkeley. So thank you, Virginia.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Grace. I'm so happy to be here today. As mentioned, I work at Futures Without Violence. We're a national organization that really provides a lot of kind of services and thinking around preventing and responding to domestic and sexual violence and childhood trauma. We do policy advocacy, research, public education campaigns, and training and technical assistance. And because I'm on the health team, I get to work with many public health departments and groups of healthcare providers to really think about how they can be engaged in preventing violence, and also working with advocates to build capacity to really address the health needs of survivors. So I'm going to admit I'm going to take about 15 or 20 minutes to talk about some different public health frameworks and theories, which is a little bit boring, and it's really the speakers that come after me that are going to talk about how these theories are really put into practice and the amazing work that you're doing in the state of Washington around taking a look at violence as a public health issue. So we know that violence is prevalent. We all know the statistics about how many people are impacted by domestic and sexual violence. But the good news is prevention is possible. I know that sometimes it can seem like an intractable social problem that is never going to end, but we actually have some really good tools and strategies to prevent violence. Violence does not have to be part of the human experience. We want to remember that as our kind of shining North Star. The issue is we need to prioritize and invest in prevention, right? And this really needs to be, this is my soapbox now, this needs to be a multi-sector effort. It can't just be domestic violence programs, sexual violence programs, trafficking programs, advocates who are responsible for doing all the prevention work. We know that experiencing violence can have lifelong impacts on education, on health outcomes, economic security. So everyone, all those systems also have a stake in preventing this type of violence. So thinking about how we can encourage partnerships with schools, with hospitals, with community centers, with other kinds of community organizations that are interacting with and have access to all of the folks that we want to spread prevention messages to, right? We want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to live free from violence, because we know that experiencing violence can mean that we're not able to live to our full human capacity. All right, so we're going to go into this knowing and really believing in our hearts that everyone has a unique and important role in preventing violence. It's not going to be just one of us. But if every one of us takes one little bite out of this pie, this prevention pie, we'll be able to truly create a future without violence. All right, so not only is prevention possible, it is smart. The science of public health is basically built on years and years of evidence that tell us prevention costs a lot less than intervention, right? So if you think about what it might cost to implement some of the community programs that my colleagues are going to be talking about later in this intervention, it is pennies on the dollar for the kinds of interventions that have to be implemented if someone has experienced violence, whether that's going to the emergency room, whether that is, you know, folks unable to work and needing other kinds of financial supports. Truly, prevention is better than a cure, right? In terms of those financial costs. Just as importantly, I think for all of us is the human cost. We don't want people to experience violence and trauma. We want people to have healthy and safe beginnings, you know, childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. So from that human perspective, you know, we do want to prevent violence. And when we think about prevention of violence, you know, really thinking about how we can change social norms. So it's not just about the individual behaviors, but really the context and the culture that have so far allowed violence to really flourish. And again, prevention is smart in kind of that academic sense because we have many years of research where we have created evidence-based strategies around prevention that we know can work and be effective. So one of the first public health theories that everyone talks about, if you've ever taken a public health class, this is probably on your very first day, you find out about this river analogy and thinking about prevention at 3 different levels: primary, secondary, and tertiary. So the analogy goes like this. You are standing next to a river and you are enjoying your picnic and you see someone in the water who is drowning, okay? And you put a boat out to them because obviously you want to help them. And they've been coughing and they need to go to the hospital. And so, you know, you get the boat, you pull them out of the water and say, boy, that was, you know, really dramatic, make sure that they're okay. But there's already been some pretty drastic and dramatic impacts on them falling in the water and almost drowning. You go back to your picnic and you keep seeing people falling into the water. So you walk a little bit further up and it's people have fallen in and they've just fallen in. So at that point, they're still able to swim. You just throw them a life preserver. So that's secondary prevention. Something has just happened. It's like the immediate emergency, and you're able to prevent them from those longer term consequences, but they've still already experienced falling in the water. So then you say, what the heck, all of these people, what's happening? You keep walking up the river and you find there's a bridge and there's a hole in the bridge and people are falling off of the bridge because the bridge is in disrepair. So what you do is you fix the bridge, and this is primary prevention. So you're actually stopping people from falling into the water at all. So that's how we think about the levels of prevention. I would say in our field, oftentimes we focus on the secondary and tertiary levels of prevention. So if you think about hotlines and shelters and other kinds of battering intervention programs, those type of things fall under secondary and tertiary. And what we're really trying to think more about and kind of build the capacity of programs to do is this primary prevention. So the other major public health framework around violence prevention is the social ecological model. And this is, I've actually met many public health professionals who have the social ecological model as a tattoo. And this is where you're taking a look at where the interventions are happening, right? So we know that in order to prevent violence, we need to focus on not just the individual, which is the smallest circle on this model. Also thinking about relationship, community, and societal. So again, I think as a field, earlier on, perhaps we focused more on the individual and relationships, right? So thinking about different models where we're hoping to change attitudes and behaviors. And then some relationships, we're thinking about, you know, skills around conflict resolution, managing emotions, things like that. And then when we move into those outer layers, which a couple of the other speakers will be speaking to, really this community level, things like bystander intervention and partnering across sectors that I talked about. And then of course, societal, thinking about policies and laws that are going to promote respectful and nonviolent relationships. I also wanted to do a shout out to our friends at the Prevention Institute. They're also here in California and have done a lot of work really thinking about how public health strategies can be applied to violence prevention. And they have this, this is kind of their biggest tool called the Spectrum of Prevention. And it really outlines what kinds of activities we can engage in order to prevent violence on these different levels. So they somewhat follow from the bottom to the top, the different levels in that social ecological model, right? So thinking down on the bottom in that purple, from strengthening individual knowledge and skills, all the way up to influencing policy and legislation. So I would encourage us all to really think about leaning into these higher level, not higher level that they're more important, but just on this picture, higher level, influencing policy and legislation, changing our organizational practices, fostering coalitions and networks, educating providers. I would say those are the areas that we want to make sure that we're paying extra attention to when we're doing our prevention work. Great. So the next kind of tool that I wanted to talk to you just a little bit about is these strategies to prevent intimate partner violence that the CDC has really done a lot of rigorous research around. There's also many of these strategies align with preventing sexual violence as well. So the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, I know right now is getting a ton of play because of COVID, but they actually have a quite robust violence prevention initiative as well. And so these are some evidence-based strategies and approaches to prevent intimate partner violence. And again, you'll see it somewhat follows the flow of that social ecological model. So teaching safe and healthy relationship skills, a lot of those, you know, classroom presentations that domestic violence programs might do is a good example. Engaging influential adults and peers. And one of those is men and boys as allies in prevention. And one of my colleagues will be speaking about a program that's happening in Washington there. Thinking about disrupting the developmental pathways toward partner violence. So things like home visitation, Head Start. Really, this is a two-generation approach, working with parents and children, because we know that oftentimes these experiences span generations. So if we can stop kind of that generational cycle, that's a very powerful prevention tool. Creating protective environments, talking about school climate and safety, policies, thinking about your workplace culture. And then there's also some really good research on physical things you can do to your physical environment that can help reduce violence. Oftentimes strategies like reducing alcohol outlet density, and then other kinds of safety measures that you can have in your physical environment. And then this last one sometimes seems like, what the heck? What does this have to do with preventing violence? Things like strengthening economic supports for families. So, you know, raising the minimum wage, having universal childcare available, you know, making sure that people's basic needs are met is a really critical part of preventing violence. Oftentimes, I think my background actually is in advocacy, and I remember thinking, you know, to me, the most important issue in front of me was the violence, but for folks who are having other kinds of economic struggles, that's going to be the preliminary thing that they need to think about, worry about, solve before having conversations about experience of violence. So always remembering, you know, we need to make sure that our community members are having their basic needs met. And that truly is a way to help prevent violence, both primary prevention and secondary prevention. And then the part that we are probably most familiar with is the kind of secondary and tertiary prevention that I talked about earlier, which is supporting survivors to increase their safety and to lessen harms. So again, I'm going to end with this, is really thinking about how experiencing violence is also a health equity issue. We know, unfortunately, some communities are disproportionately impacted by experiences of violence, and we want to create the social conditions where everyone has an opportunity to live their full lives. So here's a quote for the Prevention Institute. They have a great report on the links between violence and health equity. Violence undermines people's health by causing injury, disability, and premature death, and some groups are more affected by violence than others, especially young people of color and people living in low-income areas. So when we think about, you know, the kinds of prevention activities that we want to engage in, what communities we want to focus on, making sure that we are paying attention to the needs of communities that are typically marginalized, because the impact of violence can be, you know, more severe and more long-lasting. So we want to start our work there. All right, with that, I will hand over the mic.
Great, thank you, Virginia. So next we're going to hear from Sojourner and Duxbury and Tess Bentley from the YWCA of Pierce County. We've got their bios in the background here for you to see. But we're going to be hearing about some of the community-based prevention work that they are doing at the YWCA in Pierce County. Both of them are with the YWCA of Pierce County, and they coordinate the youth programs and the prevention program there. And just let me know when I need to advance the slide.
Thank you so much, Grace, for taking on our PowerPoint. I know that was a little bit last minute, but I appreciate you helping us out and taking us through this presentation. And also thank you, Virginia, for the wonderful intro, because I think that leads directly into what we're going to talk about in terms of YWCA services. And your analogy about primary, secondary, and tertiary experiences is kind of what we focus on at the Y. And while we do all of that, we really have expanded our prevention work for primary and secondary impacts of violence. And so it's always kind of been a natural progression for us to get those services jump-started and really to help identify with clients unhealthy relationships and empowering them through education and skill building to really take on healthier relationship choices. And so that was a really natural transition for us. I think we've always done some type of prevention work, whether it's primary, secondary, tertiary. But what we do and what I do specifically really focuses on the primary and secondary. And before we introduce clients to services at the Y, it's really important for us to identify culturally specific needs. And that really helps us to build foundations of strong cultural competency, build strong relationships, and really informs us on trauma-informed care on how we can best help a client utilize services that we have to offer. And so if you wouldn't mind flipping to the next slide. Thank you so much. This is an image that I created for the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And this is really just another version of the prevention model and the 4 quadrants of prevention that we're all kind of striving to incorporate into our programs. And this gives us a little bit of background on some of the tools that we use for the prevention work that we utilize in schools and inside of our agency. So Tess.
Sorry.
No, go right ahead.
Sorry.
So this just serves as kind of a visual for us. And this will kind of take us through some of the tools that we use while Tess kind of talks about some of the secondary impacts and the way that we address those inside of the YWCA Pierce County.
Yeah, thanks, Sojourner. So yes, I'm Tess and I'm a youth advocate at the YWCA, where we support individuals and families who have experienced domestic violence. I work within our children's programs, and within that program specifically, we do prevention work with children who are experiencing the secondary impacts of violence in their homes. And so we have curriculum-based groups that use art and activities to provide the education and skill building around the skills that are integral to prevention work and to having a happy, healthy life. So things like self-regulation and stress relief, identity development, and healthy connections and relationships. And we know it's really important that all of this information is developmentally specific and age appropriate. So we have 3 groups, one for kids 0 to 5, one for school-age kids 6 to 12, and then a group for teens, which goes from 13 to 21. And each group has advocates that focus on understanding and meeting the needs of those age groups. And then our program also knows, as Virginia said, that supporting families is really important in this work. So we have therapeutic services for both children and parents to support healing and attachment. And then as advocates, we also get to work directly with the parents to support them with resources they need, whether that's clothing or help with school or like fun birthday gifts. And then we also get to be a positive source of parenting support for them as well. So within children's program, our overall big prevention goal is to give kids information and tools that empowers them to make healthy choices in all areas of their lives. So especially when a kid's feeling triggered or overwhelmed and it's hard to make those decisions, we want them to know that they have active choices about how they respond outside of just immediately reacting. So helping them see what healthy choices there are, and then allowing that space for them to choose what's going to be best, what's going to align with their needs and their purpose. And our programs provide kind of a safe space for them to learn those skills, practice them, and then ideally master them. The skills around self-regulation, around creating relationships, and around identity. Some of this learning happens directly through teaching the skills, telling them, talking about exactly what it's about and discussing. Some is through experiential art making, and then a lot is through modeling the skills as advocates within the groups. And then with our support, they get to practice the skills with the peers in the different groups that we have. And I want to just share some examples of how this happens day to day. So for instance, in the 0 to 5 class, if a 4-year-old's having a hard time regulating and interacting with other kids, an advocate can give them some choices, like, do you want to play with some Play-Doh? Do you need a snack? Would you like to go out in the hallway and have a change of scenery? Which is really fun on our floor because we have the whole floor is covered in a nature mural with different animals and different seasons incorporated. But then the child gets to choose one, and with the support of the advocate, make it happen. So they're learning that they have autonomy and that what they need is really important. When we get into the school age groups, we do a lot of art projects. One of the ones we do is they'll get an outline of a body and get to color what happens in their bodies when they're feeling angry or scared or frustrated. And then we offer the materials to make kind of a coping skill toolbox. So we'll have like a feather to practice deep breathing to calm down, or they'll make a stress ball out of balloons to practice, relaxing their muscles. And then during the group, they have the option, if they're feeling overwhelmed or need some space, to sit on a bench outside of the room and use this toolbox to practice some of those skills until they can come back in and be ready to join the group again. So they're learning that they can take a step back and they have the power to regulate themselves, and that this has a positive effect on their relationships with their peers when they come back in. And then with teens, we have a lot of opportunity for discussions and kind of we talk about relationships a lot. One activity we'll do is create actual flags. So we'll create red flags for things in relationships that haven't felt so good, or kind of signal to us that something's not very healthy. And we'll also make green flags for things that are really great in relationships that we look for. And we'll incorporate that into our discussion about our group agreements within the room, so that we're choosing what kind of space we want and how we want to treat each other. And then because those are posted in the room, they have the opportunity to hold themselves accountable and each other, and also me as a facilitator in creating that healthy space. So our prevention work really goes beyond just talking about what's healthy and what's not healthy. It happens in our day-to-day interactions and involves practicing making those informed and empowered choices that benefit ourselves and the people around us. And we find that this is really effective. We survey parents to get feedback, and that's what some of these quotes on the slides are. And we hear that the work we're doing in our program has noticeable and positive effects on kids in their lives outside of our groups, which is really our goal. So yeah, this slide has some parents saying, my children loves the groups and have been expressing her feelings in more appropriate ways, or talking about how they've noticed their kids' confidence and communication increase with the parent and with other kids. And that last quote talking about how her daughter has been able to open up about her sexuality and is learning what healthy relationships look like and what she wants out of them. So we're always really excited to see that.
Okay.
Fabulous.
Should I move on, or?
Yeah, I think you can go to the next slide if you're ready
Okay.
to.
Okay.
So this is a visual of some of the swag that we give out as part of our school-based prevention program. It is called Healthy Love, and we have this really cute logo that happens to be really cool for teens. Oftentimes they put their shirts on almost immediately after we give them. So our Healthy Love program is a 10-week intensive curriculum. It really aims to help young adults who are wanting to either get out of this cycle of abuse or looking to make, preemptive choices to have healthier relationships. And we do that through education and understanding of what unhealthy relationship behaviors are and really how to counteract them with healthy behaviors. Participants are supported in developing skills that will allow them to make healthy choices and decrease their chances of entering into abusive relationships. We also incorporate the interconnected nature of social groups such as race, class, gender, and how these groups can really influence intimate partnerships while we talk about that, and simultaneously discussing how we can achieve justice for everybody. Our programs are based in the modeling of strong relationships, trauma-informed integration of mindfulness, self-regulation practices, and really a lot of trust. We use this as a basis to support young adults in developing themselves and empowering them to make those choices. We try to present at least 2 to 3 cycles of this curriculum per school that we choose because it gives us an opportunity to witness foundational change in classrooms. The more times a student has participated in the program, the more they are aware of what's going on in their community, what's going on around them, and the greater their community awareness and accountability is. At the end of our time together in the classroom, we culminate with a community project and we do a celebration. We ask students, we have a really cool button maker that we use for the Y, and we ask students to make buttons that will reflect something, at least one thing that they've learned through the course of Healthy Love. And we had to put a rule in place where we could only make 1 button for personal things, because you can do 1 button with learning, 1 for personal. We had a young student who made like 14 different buttons with a whole Jonas Brothers song across her backpack. So at that point, we kind of had to tailor that a little bit, but they definitely have a lot of fun, and it's a really cool way for them to share, even in passive ways, just letting somebody else know with the sight of a button that this is a safe space for something, that this is a consensual space for something, and that tends to work really well. At the end of our time together in the classroom, We also kind of have them express these learning with peers, and we provide them with manuals and t-shirts like we saw on the previous slide that are all really cool ways for us to branch out into community branding. We often have people in the community, whether I'm out at a gas station with my shirt on or we're doing an event where we're wearing the swag, parents and students from previous classes will often approach us and tell us about their experiences. We had a student who was really struggling with relationships, wanting to be in one, not knowing how to initiate. And after going through the healthy love cycle, we ran into him later at school, and he was really proud to tell us that he was in a happy, healthy, consensual relationship and that it was working really well for him. So that was really just one example of how we see these definite changes happen in students, and how broad our community reach is. And this really is another communication of our program, of the foundational skills that we're building, and it gives them opportunities to also discuss these with their families at home. We also had another student who got the manual and said, I'm gonna take it home right now, slap it on the table at dinner, and my parents and I are gonna talk about this. So there's really a lot of support behind it too, the accountability with students as well.
Great.
So for us, prevention is really just a beautiful collaboration of all of the concepts that were previously discussed, along with all of sort of the 4 modules of prevention. We try to incorporate all of those and really get prevention on every level as much as we can. And this is really just a guidance that we use to help young adults learn how to thrive, because that's really a pivotal point for us, is when we can see that foundational change. And also being in the schools for 2 or 3 sessions really allows us to cultivate that school classroom community awareness. And it has really been a wonderful experience for both of us.
And it's exciting to hear or to see that our branding and our messages are getting out in the community. I was grocery shopping the other day and saw someone with the Healthy Love shirt on, and I got so excited.
Okay, great. Thank you. So thank you for sharing what's been going on in Tacoma at the Pierce County Y. I'm checking to see, is Taryn still here? Okay, there's Taryn, great. So we're gonna next hear from Taryn from Seattle College. If you'd like, are you there? I'm looking for you. I don't see you. And looking for your slide. Oh, there you are. I see you. So let me introduce you. Taryn is a mother, an anti-violence organizer, activist, cultural studies scholar, professor of communications for Seattle colleges. And in a previous life, Taryn co-led an anti-rape organization called Communities Against Rape and Abuse, which centered on marginalized communities and their intersectional oppression experience. She was a member of the Committee on Women, Population, and the Environment, the African American Coalition on Sexual Assault and Domestic Violence in Seattle, a founding member of Insight, Women of Color Against Violence Seattle chapter, and the Infant Mortality Coalition. And I won't keep on reading, but I'm excited to hear at another time about your poetry and how you're raising a future firefighter, and about your son's career choices and your ask for prayers. But I was gonna go on and see if you could talk with us about what domestic violence and sexual assault prevention means for young people in communities of color, especially in the current context where there are policy discussions about reducing police budgets and investing in community supports and prevention. And would love to hear your insights on those discussions.
Well, thank you so much, Grace, for the invitation to come and talk with all of you today. I apologize for being late. I admit, after I got caught up with students, I got caught up with housework. You know how you just see something forever and you're just like, where's the bleach? I'm getting that stain out of there. And so I thank you. And my tardiness is not a reflection of how I hold you and lift your work. So I would say that my experience when it comes to sexual assault and domestic violence and the experience of young people, that one, that young people are likely, at least the people that I encounter, are folks who were exposed to some form of abuse that involved sex when they were much younger. And then they have just maladapted to the situation or their life situation and then acting according to that. Our organization, when I was at CARA, we did have a youth program and it focused on homeless young people. And we, I'm sure that it's not news to you that the majority of homeless young people that we were supporting were kids of color, kids who were queer, and kids who experienced some kind of violence in their early childhood. So by the time that they were at our organization, they were reaching out for support with actually not wanting to go to any kind of an institution, whether it was law enforcement, medical industrial complex, or worse yet, sometimes their parents, because what we know doing this work is that parents are sometimes the abuser of the kids that we were trying to support. So there was a lot of creativity and strategizing on the parts of the directors of that program and the young people who were volunteering with that program. And a couple of the volunteers actually went on to be organizers and leaders in their own community, including Johanna, the recent former director of API Chaya, right? So that's how those activists were coming up. I would say when I think about this particular bill and the goals of Seattle Public School to introduce this level of learning to our students and at as early an age as possible, I say that those are the kinds of things that help children express what is happening to them and their bodies. And sometimes is able, not sometimes, but often can serve as a way for them to understand that their body is their own to touch and for no one else, right? And I would say that the language that we try to use at CARA with young people was not only informed by the anti-violence movement and specifically texts like, Insight Women of Color Against Violence, or texts that address sexual assault and communities of color. And there's a few of those that I can't just think of off the top of my head, but I would be more than glad to put together a list and send it to Grace, and then she can share it out with the whole committee if that's something you guys would like. But that when young people have that information earlier, they are they have that information and that knowledge become tools that they can use to begin to set boundaries for themselves. And really how we enter the conversation with young people was around boundaries and consent. Now the conversation, I'm also a former homeschooler. My son is, currently in a very tiny private school right now, but we were homeschoolers, and it was Black Star Line homeschool family and education center, because we realized that with homeschooling, it's not so much the kids you got to worry about, it's actually the parents, because they're like, homeschooling, are you kidding? How am I going to do this? And so we found that we actually needed to generate support and knowledge for the parents who were wanting to take leadership in their students or their children's learning intentionally. In those spaces, we had conversations with our children about boundaries. And I found that it became that when children would be getting like on each other's nerves in some of our community spaces, I would hear the kids saying, I told you no, that's my boundary, right? And it being able to have those boundary conversations with our kids supported their own organic learning from their friends, the internet, social media, their own learning about sexuality and body. They were able to marry those experiences with this concept of boundary setting. And I can say that, or I can tell you, and I know this is, at this point, what I'm sharing is anecdotal information. I'm aware of that. But I can tell you that there was an example would be my own child was in a theater class. And there was a little boy that, another little African-American boy, that they were like, yay, we're here together. And the little boy was super excited to always see my son. And so he started, he's very huggy. And, my son, it turns out to be more of an introvert than I ever could have imagined. But when kids would come up to hug him, he'd be like, and I would say, his people would be like, Mayfield, stop giving people that Seattle look and that Seattle hug, lean into it, brother. And other people, I'd just be like, he's not really a hugger unless he really knows you. But at this point, my son was 6 and he had this little boy in his class and the little boy would be hugging. And he's like, yeah, he hugs me a lot. And I said, well, do you like it? He's like, not really. And I said, well, just say, hey, that's a boundary. I don't want to be hugged, right? And so he began to say that. And the kid was like, oh, okay. And then eventually the kid started kissing him. It'd be kiss on the cheek. And then one time he went in for a kiss on the lips. My son was like, Mom, I do not like that. And I said, well, have you explained to him that that's not what you want? And he said, I try and he doesn't listen. And I said, well, what can I do to support you? He's like, can you just be with me when I tell him? And I said, yeah, how about I be in the area? Because you don't want your child, you don't want another person's child to feel intimidated with the parent of the child that's telling you to stop standing by. So after class, we waited, and his grandmother was his caregiver, is his caregiver, talking to the theater teacher, and my son and I hung back. And so as soon as she walked off, my son goes up to the kid and he goes, I don't like it when you kiss me. I want to be your friend, but that's a boundary. And I don't like you crossing my boundaries. And I've told you to stop hugging me and to stop kissing me. And it just and to leave me alone. And it just kind of went down the list. And what was interesting was that the grandmother of the other child was aghast, right? She was aghast because, one, the instructor heard the conversation and decided to come back into the conversation. And she's Caucasian and everybody else there is Black. And I thought this is problematic for her to witness this because it's going to get filtered in this way that I know that grandmother is going to not really appreciate at all. And so that's exactly what happened. And this lady, she says, I have never in my life heard a child use language like that. Boundary setting, what is that even? And I was like, well, this is just information about what needs to happen in the community. And she got very upset. She tried to shut the conversation down. Her grandson was like, I never do that. I never do that. And so the conversation with my son, or our debrief, because, his mom just was in the field. So that's what we call those. And in the debrief, he was like, whoa. He said his grandma's mad. I said, yeah, she's not angry at you though. She's not. She's frustrated. And that's okay, because I'll talk to his grandma. How do you feel about what happened? He said, well, he lied. And I said, okay, I understand that. It's hard when people tell you not to do something, and adults are around, then they get embarrassed. And so they say it's not true. But how do you feel sharing that with him? He says, it'll feel better. And I said it, and he's like, I hope he does it. So later in the evening, after my son went to bed, I called the grandmother, and of course, summarily got cussed out. Cussed out. How dare you guys bring that up to my son right in front of that white woman? And she already telling me that he's acting out in class, and bloop, 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 bloop. And so what I did was I went to Advocate Head, and I just received the information. I just received it. And then I told her, sister, I love you. I have mad love for you. I think your grandson is awesome. I said, one of the practices that we have in our community spaces is supporting our children to set boundaries for themselves. And the reason why is because when we do this and they have accurate information about their bodies, they are better able to address what may be happening to them in another kind of setting, particularly something that they know is wrong or they don't desire to engage. I said, so it's actually just coming from a place of arming our children with language and information about their own body autonomy. And of course, she's just like, body autonomy, you know, she she sounds like my mom and dad. Because they were like, you know, my parents were from the South. You talk about body autonomy, they don't know what you're talking about. They like, go get the belt, right? You gonna get in trouble. You set this thing on fire. You did this, you did that. But I, of course, and my sister and I talked intentionally about how to interrupt what we experienced in our childhoods and to create something different, because we know what we want for the community as our children grow older. I will also just add quickly that one of the ways that I continue to be an activist in my community as it pertains to sexual violence and domestic violence is that I am an independent facilitator of conversations around those issues when events have occurred in the community. And so a recent conversation that I've been a part of is one that have involved members of Black Lives Matter and members of some of the activists from the CHOP organizing around the death of George Floyd, because there was, you know, and it was a group of sisters that came to me and they were like, this brother is not leaving the kids alone. He keeps coming into these spaces. We know we're organizing and trying to change how Black people are are managing violence in our lives. And he shows up and he is a known and identified perpetrator. And I said, okay. So what I was able to do is just be present during their conversations in order to help facilitate their desired process. What did they want to do with this individual, and how did they want to have the conversation about sexual violence and domestic violence at the same time they're having a conversation about state violence against Black bodies, right? And my organization, CARA, used to specifically do that work. Those were the intersections that we were taking up with young people, people with disabilities in the African American community, and by extension, our allies, partnering with folks working in the Latinx community, the API, Chaya community, the Native American community, and lots of folks within the queer community. And a lot of times, those queer folks were in these other communities. And so what we were striving for was this reality that as marginalized people, we often don't turn to state systems for support. That in fact, those same state systems that are set forth to protect and to heal have been instrumental in the oppression of marginalized people. And so our organization was trying to support communities to learn about domestic violence and sexual assault and to name for themselves what safety and accountability looked like. And as it turned out, because of the relationship that the criminal legal system has with various communities and Black communities at the time that I was an activist at CARA, um, uh, those folks don't already call the police when they are in a domestic violence situation. They don't already call the police necessarily when they've been sexually assaulted. And in the times that they have, or they've encountered the police have either been their perpetrator of sexual violence or has increased the violence against their bodies in the name of the state. And so we already know that there's community out there that operates like that, and what they need are tools. So when we start talking about defunding the police, we can think about what does support for people who want to organize their own safety look like, right? And how does that money get reallocated and given to community such that community can create spaces where conversations and where relationships exist, right? It's not just conversations. These are people who have had relationships with each other since they were kids. I'm new to Seattle. Well, I'm not that new. I've been here for about 25 years. And I know. People say, well, you from Seattle? But I left Colorado at 30, so I really don't feel like I'm from Seattle. That's beside the point. The thing is, what I've noticed is that people who are from here, they've known each other their entire lives, if not a significant part of their life. And so when we talk about reallocating funds and giving them to community, you're giving them to community to people who are already in relationship with each other. They don't have to build that relationship to then have those hard conversations. When I come in as a facilitator, people ask me because that's specifically my background, but I'm also comfortably and removed enough from many of the Black communities in which I traverse that I can be a bit more neutral and facilitate a process where people can speak their truths and then build on ideas for safety and accountability. And we're currently still in the process with that gentleman who insists on coming to events when Black young people are organizing. He has been identified as a sexual perpetrator in the community and one who is around kids. And so the women that I'm working with, and a large number of them are queer women. Some of them are African women. They are women who recognize themselves as part of an African diaspora, right? And they come in with it, hard in all the rest of their lives. And they're like, we don't need the brother's help right now. They are not hearing it. We need to figure this out for ourselves. And I'm like, this is amazing, because I'm no longer located in a space that says communities against rape and abuse. I'm literally somebody that they have to go, call Theron. Yes, let's call Theron. And that's how I get those calls. And lastly, one of the places where I've been able to spend some time is, in fact, with two families that I was very close to. But one of the families has a child who has, as a child, sexually perpetrated on other children. And when it came to light who these children were, I always tell community, I am not, my training is old, right? So I can retain a lot, but in order to get like the most updated information, I can turn you to some resources. And when the school gets involved, this will be reported. And so you have to ready yourself for that. And I don't, I make choices to report or not report based on what I know a family's struggle or their needs are. Because some families absolutely do not need the state in their house. Absolutely not. And that's what's clear about being Black and being in the lab with my people and dealing with this issue. But this particular family, it had already been reported. And the problem was that they were so integrated in all of their activities, same school, same tap classes, same art classes, same swim lessons. And we had the initial conversation right here in my home. And one of the father of the aggressor, was late and came in very high, right? And so then that said a lot to the other family. But what we were able, or what was able to be created, was a space where both families can speak their truth, right? And the humanity of the aggressor is held with a lot of love and is lifted along with the humanity of the children that have been targeted by that particular aggressor. And the families were trying to have conversations like, how do we do Kwanzaa this year? How are we going to go to the tap recitals now? How are we going to even move forward? And the mother of the survivors was like, I'm not moving forward. This is over. And the mother of the aggressor, that was just really hard. That was really hard because, you know, by the grace of God, there go I. It happened to be her kid. And so then we talked about ways that her child can get, both sets of kids can get the support that they need. And eventually, you know, folks changed schools, kids got therapy through the Harborview. Children had psychological conversations and support. And really, all of these kids right now, except for the aggressor's probably my son's age, 17 right now, but the other kids are in 6th grade. And what is interesting is that their mother says that damaged them. And she can see the permanent effects, but she's grateful that they have better information about who they are, their bodies and boundaries more so now, and that they are able to practice that moving forward. So I tell that story just to reiterate the fact that when we give young people, and as early as possible, right, developmentally possible, the more we give them information about who they are and their bodies, the more grounded they can become in understanding their own autonomy. And then given, you know, lessons in language around boundary setting really supports. It doesn't necessarily, it's not a panacea prevention for sexual assault, but what it does is give our children the ability to articulate what is happening to them a lot sooner, and maybe before it even gets worse, so that parents can then intervene in the way they see fit. So I think that's what I have to offer.
Awesome.
Okay.
Great. And it's a great lead in into our last presenter today, Rebecca Millman. Let's see here. Let's see if we've got a slide from Tania. So in introducing Rebecca, Rebecca is the Prevention Education Manager at Harborview. Thank you for introducing Harborview. Abuse and Trauma Center in Seattle, where she's worked since 2008 to prevent sexual assault and creates safer communities, and has worked in writing the Safer Family, Safer World prevention resource for parents, is a co-author of the FLASH curriculum, a comprehensive sexual health curriculum, and the lead author of Athletes as Leader program, a prevention program for high school students. We're gonna lead into, she works as an active member of the Seattle Public Schools Title IX Task Force and coaching boys into men.
Good evening, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for having me here. It's an honor to be on this panel. And Theron, thank you so much for all of the stories that you just shared, and also really sharing a lot of the history of our field locally. And also, I just feel like it's the best type of learning to learn from these kind of personal experiences that come up. And I also really appreciate you sharing the power of prevention and how comprehensive sexual health education, even at the youngest grades, is, I would agree, really one of the best strategies to prevent sexual and dating violence. So I'm going to be talking about that today. One of the things I wanted to say before you move forward, Grace, with the slide is that, you know, Virginia talked earlier about the soapbox. I'm going to get on my soapbox here for a second. That, you know, when we really think about just in life in general, as educators, as parents, as community members, what really are the most important things that we need to be teaching young people? Do we actually have any specific field or occupation that the majority of our young people will pursue? I mean, really, when we think about it, is there any one thing that the majority of our young people will pursue later in life as adults? And really, we do have that thing. The one aspect of life that the overwhelming majority of our young people will pursue and engage themselves in is relationships, right? In fact, like thinking about this year and how difficult it's been in the community and in our country, we have really learned firsthand one of the things that really gets us through life is our relationships. At the end of our life, that is one of the only things that people have, is our relationships. And so when we think about what are the most important things to be talking to young people about, why would we not be spending and investing in that education of what it takes to be in healthy relationships? And as the folks from YWCA said, that healthy love, right? And there are so many great ways to talk about this with kids, even at the youngest grades. So Grace, we can go to the next slide. I'll talk first about some of the work that we do with elementary school students. So these are our youngest folks in the school system, K through 5. And I just wanted to give some examples, and Theron shared a lot of really great examples of ways that family members and community members can talk to their young people related to bodily autonomy and teaching about that boundary setting. And I just want to share a few more examples. So when we talk about consent, you know, people often associate that concept with sexual situations, but consent really is everything. You know, every interaction with another person is an opportunity for us to infuse consent education, and it doesn't have to be anything sexual in nature when we're talking with the youngest children. So for example, like, how do we ask up here if they want to play? When we're playing a game with someone, how can we really tell if they're really into that game, if they really want to play? Teaching children to not only listen to folks' words. So when Theron was sharing that story about her son setting that boundary, you know, how can we teach kids to set the boundary, but also how can we teach the children who are hearing that boundary being set and respect that, right? So how can we teach kids to really hear a no and accept a no, and maybe find an alternative activity? Maybe there's something else that they want to do together. You can do this through, you know, role playing, and that's a great way to, you know, have young people be prepared for those interactions that they might encounter. The YWCA folks also talked about teaching kids to manage strong emotions, right? And promote empathy. Those are other really important strategies. And we also really want to make sure that we're including parents and caregivers in this discussion. So the next slide shows the booklet that Grace mentioned earlier, A Safer Family, A Safer World. And I'm just going to really quickly post the link in the chat. This is a booklet that exists online, but we also have hard copies. If anyone wants a copy or a stack, let us know. We do have them translated into the top 10 languages of Seattle. So we have them available in all 10 languages. And I'm going to go ahead and let's see, there we go. Paste that into the chat. And this booklet is basically breaking it down kind of by the subject area, and just gives tools for parents and caregivers to also reinforce this type of education with their students. And what we really tried to do when creating this was not to tell parents, don't say this, don't say this, don't say this, but rather what you should say or what you can do or activities that you can do to promote, for example, boundary setting and respecting other people's boundaries. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. So when we get to the older grades, talking about middle school and high school, so in these grades, we can start teaching a lot of those intervention strategies. So what do we do when someone is causing harm or being aggressive? And having kids practice strategies to intervene in a way that feels safe to them. So how to support a person who's being bullied or harassed, how to role play asking for consent. Again, it doesn't always have to be a sexual thing. You can have students practice how to, ask for consent if another person wants to hang out with you after school, or post a picture on social media, or share personal information, or borrow something from them, right? All of those should have an element of consent. And again, it's not just teaching how to ask for consent, but also how to respect the answer. We really need to normalize, this is my soapbox right here, we really need to normalize rejection. We do not do a good enough job in our society teaching that rejection is part of life. And someone telling you no is okay, right? We just need to kind of normalize that a little bit more. It really happens all the time. And the way that we accept that no and show that we respect that no is critically important in prevention. When we get into the older grades too, when we're talking about older middle school, high school, we can start talking about like specific situations with dating relationships and sexual interactions and what consent means. Affirmative consent, which many people have heard that term, is really kind of promoting that idea that really only a yes means yes. The absence of a no, if someone just doesn't say no, if they're just like kind of saying nothing, that does not indicate a yes. And so again, we want to promote really making sure that we're not engaging in any activity unless the other person actually really is into this and wants this themselves. We also need to kind of talk about what equality and respect looks like in a dating relationship. Sometimes with high school students, we'll have them analyze different scenarios and talk about elements of consent and coercion if they were present, and what folks would do in that kind of situation. And then of course, there's so much influence from the media, from social media and from media on young people. And we want to kind of break down some of those messages, like some of those traditional expectations of gender in many cultures, as well as the media messages about like what it means to act like a girl or act like a boy, how that can really affect the way that people behave in relationships and also make health decisions. So really breaking that down with our older students. So I'm a huge supporter of comprehensive sexual health education. I think it is the most effective way to do really universal prevention with our young people. And the next slide, I wanted to talk about another strategy besides sexual health education in the classroom is also outside of the classroom. We also have some other great opportunities to infuse prevention into young people's lives, for example, in the sports setting. So when we're talking about older kids in a high school setting, a lot of time, first of all, a lot of students are involved with sports, and sports can be a great platform to talk about prevention, because a lot of times athletes tend to hold what we call social capital. They have some social influence. And I just wrapped up a project at a local high school here, Garfield, where we implemented 2 programs. One is called Coaching Boys into Men, and one is called Athletes as Leaders. Coaching Boys into Men, which Virginia mentioned earlier, is an evidence-based program for athletes on boys teams. And so instead of someone like me coming in and talking to the boys someone like me, like who no one can relate to basically, instead the strategy is training the coaches to talk to their athletes about things like healthy relationships and consent.
As a young man playing a sport, you are supposed to be aggressive, strong, unemotional.
We kind of have the sense that you have to intimidate the opponent.
I don't think anyone at this age has that level of self-esteem. So especially when you're in something like football, you're even more vulnerable. I think that that's why people lash out.
So what are some of the examples of disrespect behavior towards women and girls? I've had some success playing college football and playing in the NFL, but I really felt like this is what I was called to do, was to mentor young men.
We know that sexual assault is a problem in our society. So Coaching Boys into Men is an evidence-based violence prevention program that is geared towards male athletes, specifically delivered by coaches. All they have to do is have these 15-minute conversations for 12 sessions throughout their season, and they might be preventing a future incident.
If you're walking with your mom to the grocery store, you don't want nobody yelling, "Hey, baby!" You would feel a certain type of way, right? Like, man, I know I ain't talking to my mom like that, right?
There was things in there that I noticed that I've done in the past, and like with Boys to Men, I just realized, that should change. So I started to buy into what Coach was telling us.
Led to a lot of really good discussions, a lot of really honest discussions about our lives, our relationships.
Athletes have a lot of social capital. They're the leaders in their community. And if they represent respect, nonviolence, and integrity, it then can spread like wildfire in a school.
So I would say to any principal, this is really worth its weight in gold. It really will have an impact on the culture in your building.
You're creating the building blocks to empowering our young men.
That duty falls on us to actually go out and prove to people that we can be in healthy relationships.
Ready? Yeah!
I think that's happening.
Awesome. Okay.
Thank you so much. So
Okay, I gotta turn it off.
Okay, it's gonna go to the next video probably.
Okay.
So I think for the sake, Grace, thank you so much, by the way, for dealing with the technology. I really appreciate it. Oh, awesome. There are some folks in the video. Yeah, it was really fun supporting coaches in that project, and actually the only time, because it's really intended to be men and boys and boys teams, that actually I'd never actually seen them implement the program until we filmed that video with Futures Without Violence. That was the only time I actually got to see the coaches in action, which was hugely rewarding and a privilege to see some of these conversations. For the sake of time, I'm going to wrap it up, but I did put some other links in the chat if folks want to check out the program for girls teams called Athletes as Leaders. And then lastly, if you know of high school teams who would like to get involved, we do have a new partnership with some of our local professional sports teams that are making these programs free and accessible to any high school and any high school sports team in the entire state. And that initiative is called Team Up Washington. I put the link in the chat, so feel free to check it out and let folks know about what's going on. And I'll hand it back over to you, Grace.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. And it's great to see some of the efforts that all of you are working on across the state, the exciting programming and prevention efforts and development of curricula and all of the things that folks are working on. And so I wasn't sure, we do have a few minutes for questions, about 5 minutes for folks that may have questions for us. And I am not sure whether Dania, if you've gotten any through email, or if others have any, you can send them in the chat, or I'm not sure, or we can try and unmute you to see if you've got questions for us. Oh, I see Claire has one, right? Is that right?
Yeah,
okay.
I sent an email. Hi, I'm Senator Wilson, and I'm the sponsor of Senate Bill 5395. And Rebecca, I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about your thinking around the Approve R90 that's on the ballot right now, and what your thoughts are about how important this is and how it might be important for young people across our state.
I would love to speak on that, and I also am a government employee, so I'm not able on work time to talk about what my position is on that, but what I can share is that folks should be looking out for their ballot and referendum 90. So we had Senate Bill 5395 pass in this state earlier this year, requiring school districts to do comprehensive sex ed for K-12, and now we have a referendum on the bill that, you know, is important to look out for. And what I can say is that I believe that comprehensive sexual health education is one of the most important strategies to prevent sexual violence and prevent domestic violence. And I actually, the thought of comprehensive sex ed being taught, sexual health education being taught so comprehensively and so widely actually gives me, you know, it makes me think, wow, we could actually see potentially community level reductions in violence. And that's all I can say.
No, and I appreciate that. And I guess I was thinking more of the bill side and how important those pieces are. And I think what I heard you say was everything you talked about, the importance of the prevention and the safety pieces. And I just appreciate that, because I think I heard the other speakers talk also about oftentimes what happens to our populations and our communities as we age. And, you know, if we were able to really, as you say, normalize our conversations, we would perhaps see outcomes along our entire continuum that look differently. So, and I apologize if I put you on the spot. I didn't mean to do that. But I was also appreciative of your work on the FLASH curriculum.
Okay, thank you. I mean, this was one of the points of, I mean, one of the pieces we were thinking about when we put together this panel to begin with, because there are so many conversations happening, you know, not just about, you know, sexual health education, but also in the larger community context about, you know, what have we done for decades now on investing in addressing domestic and sexual violence, and for Domestic Violence Awareness Month. I mean, since so many conversations are circulating around, well, you know, we've put a lot of resources into you know, this aspect of the work and intervention in this aspect of the work. And, you know, I've, like some of us on this panel have been doing this work for 20 to 30 years, and we're seeing families come back through our programs that we saw, you know, their parents 20 years ago or 10 years ago. And we just are, you know, really excited and interested in that, you know, there are larger conversations now happening around preventing violence before it starts. So, do we have any other questions or comments from our folks? Any that we can put in the text? Oh, it looks like both. Did Virginia want to say something, or Taryn?
I just wanted to say really quickly, as my kiddo has grown up, with me doing this work, what I have learned especially from his male instructors, is that whenever things happen in a classroom setting that's really problematic and sexist or misogynist, that my son is the one who interrupts it when it's coming from other guys. Because the conversation as he's gotten older is, you're the ally, right? You're the ally. So you can't just have a mama like me and do nothing. You have to like get in there and interrupt. And the teachers pull me aside and they go, wow, that's like, he's amazing. You know, and he supports queer people and women who are in those situations in his class. So I just want to say, like, they are coming. These young people are here. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Anybody else have any? Okay, well, we are at 5 o'clock, and I really want to thank all of you who took the time out today to join us. Thank you to our panelists for you know, putting together something quickly and engaging with us on trying to educate our communities about what it means to invest in prevention. And I really hope that this is the start of some, you know, ongoing conversations, or, you know, we've provided some resources and feedback for you to be able to take back to your communities, to be able to engage in some of these larger conversations that we're all having as we think about city council budgets or state budgets and all of those things, as well as support, you know, when we're thinking about addressing supporting our local programs, who are, of course, working with families right now that are struggling in a larger context of a pandemic and staying at home and struggling to figure out how to educate their kids and all of those things. So hoping that that you'll look at the resources and we will try to get some of those back out to you who have registered, and this recording should be available on the Women's Commission website for folks to be able to take a look at later. So with that, thank you again, and I'll be in touch with all of you. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right.